Did you know that Scarface himself liked to play the banjo in prison? Or that he ran a soup kitchen that fed thousands of Chicago citizens? Or how about that time in the milk bottling racket? It's time for 50 facts about the world's most notorious gangster, Al Capone. Number 50. One of the most well-known facts about Al Capone is that he's responsible for the term money laundering. This is supposedly due to the fact that Capone purchased laundromats as fronts for his illegal businesses. As entertaining as that sounds, it actually is not true. Capone's front businesses were primarily nightclubs, restaurants, and other businesses with ties to Chicago nightlife, mixed with a cover story as a second-hand furniture salesman. He did commit a lot of what would later be known as money laundering, though, or using deceptive means to make illegally obtained funds appear legitimate. Number 49. We know Capone was in the illegal booze racket, but did you know about his time as a milk mogul? In the early 1930s, he and his brother acquired a milk processor, Meadowmore Dairies Inc. They would ship in cheaper milk from Wisconsin, then bottle it at Meadowmore and resell it. Rumor has it, according to researcher Gus Russo, that Capone once said to some of his business associates, "Did you know there's a bigger markup in fresh milk than there is in alcohol? Honest to God, boys, we've been in the wrong racket all along." This foray into the dairy industry led to what former Chicago police officer Fred Pasente called the ensuing milk wars. Things got so serious that at one point Capone's crew allegedly kidnapped the milk union's president and held him for ransom. Number 48. In 1930, Al Capone made the cover of Time magazine. Just goes to show he wasn't just infamous, he was regular old famous too. Number 47. During his time in Alcatraz, Capone traded his more illegal hobbies for pursuits of the musical variety. He purchased a banjo and began to practice, even earning the chance to play in the Rock Islanders, the inmate band that performed concerts on Sundays. He claimed to have written a song too, Madonna Mia, which was supposedly about his wife. The song was actually written by someone else, and Capone just transferred it to a higher key, adding plagiarism to his already long list of crimes. Number 46. While Al Capone took the illegal route in life, his oldest brother went in the opposite direction. James Vincenzo Capone changed his name to Richard James Hart after leaving home. He eventually settled in Nebraska, where he became a federal prohibition agent, devoting his life to enforcing the very same laws that Al was breaking. He and Al had a few things in common, though. In the 1930s, he was convicted of manslaughter for killing a wanted man who refused to surrender, and later he lost his position as a justice of the peace when he was caught stealing from a local grocery store. Number 45. When his birthday rolls around, what do you get the mob boss who has everything? In 1926, several of Capone's boys must have been wondering the same thing when they came to an insane conclusion. They tracked down Fats Waller, a popular jazz musician, and kidnapped him at gunpoint outside of the Sherman Hotel, forcing him into a black limousine. The car's driver took Waller and his captors to the Hawthorne Inn, where a party was in full swing. Waller was led to a piano and told to play a song. As he finished, he got a better look at the crowd and realized just who the party was for: Al Capone. According to the report by The Independent, Fats Waller was treated about as well as a kidnapped victim could be. He was paid $100 per song and given limitless food and drinks. The party lasted for 3 days, with Waller napping at his piano between sets. When the celebration wrapped up, Waller was taken back to the Sherman Hotel and set free unharmed and several $1,000s richer. Number 44. Though Al Capone is most famously associated with the city of Chicago, where he spent the majority of his career, he was actually born in Brooklyn, New York. He came from a family of Italian immigrants, one of 9 children who lived in the household. His mother worked as a seamstress, and his father was a barber. Number 43. Young Al dropped out of middle school by the time he was 14. Instead of school, he worked a series of odd jobs in places like candy stores, bowling alleys, and manufacturing plants. Of course, he quickly got bored with these more legitimate forms of work and pivoted to the life of crime that made him famous. Number 42. When he stopped working these more legal jobs, Al joined several different street gangs consisting largely of other teenage boys, including the South Brooklyn Rippers, 40 Thieves Juniors, and James Street Boys. These gangs became famous for their vandalism, shoplifting, and other petty crimes, rather than the more serious offenses Al got up to in adulthood. His time running with these various youth gangs would serve as a stepping stone on his path to becoming a prominent mob boss. Number 41. Al Capone left Brooklyn for Chicago in 1919 in order to escape a potential murder charge. He was suspected of 2 homicides and could feel the law closing in on him. So he packed up with his wife and family and relocated to the Windy City. Number 40. Al earned his nickname Scarface due to the noticeable scars marking his face. No one ever said mobsters were particularly creative with nicknames. Number 39. Al didn't get his signature scars during a fight with a rival gang leader or an escape from the cops. His face was scarred during his time working as a bartender and a bouncer at the Harvard Inn, a dance hall and saloon in Coney Island. There are a few variations on the story surrounding the injury, but one of the most popular versions is that while at work, Capone insulted the sister of Frank Galluccio, a local petty thief. Enraged, Galluccio pulled out a pocket knife and slashed Al across the face 3 times. Some versions of the story say that Galluccio had the help of another man, or that the brawl occurred at a different bar, but the outcome was always the same, a series of scars on Capone's face. In spite of a permanent injury, he must not have had too big of a grudge against Galluccio because he would later hire him to work as his bodyguard at a salary of $100 a week. Number 38. Though they were a famous part of his image, Capone was embarrassed by his scars and hated his infamous nickname. He would frequently lie about where the marks came from, claiming that they were caused by an injury he sustained from shrapnel while fighting in France during World War I. Even though he never actually fought in World War I, now let's add stolen valor to that crime list. Number 37. During his time as a member of the James Street Boys, Capone became acquainted with a man named Johnny Torrio, who would end up becoming his mentor. Torrio introduced Capone to Frankie Yale, leader of Manhattan's infamous 5 Points Gang, and by the age 16, he was a member of that gang too. Johnny Torrio was a heck of a mentor for a young gangster to have, nicknamed the Fox for his cunning and quick wit. Under his guidance, Capone would later find himself joining up with Torrio in Chicago as part of the Colosimo mob. This was where he cut his teeth on the illegal brewing, distilling, and distribution of beer and liquor. If it weren't for Torrio, Al Capone might have never become the Al Capone we know today. Number 36. Did you know that Al Capone became a criminal kingpin at the tender age of 26? After Big Jim Colosimo, leader of the Colosimo mob, was killed, Torrio took over, but his reign wouldn't last long. He ordered the killing of Dean O'Banion, leader of the Irish North Side Gang, who was killed outside his flower shop in November of 1924. The next year, the Irish North Side Gang retaliated, attempting to assassinate Torrio via a shootout. The attempt failed to kill Torrio, but he was severely wounded and decided to hang up his hat. He retired and passed control of the Chicago-based gang to his protege, Al Capone. Number 35. Al Capone's Chicago outfit was a massively profitable venture. Outfit here doesn't refer to his iconic suits, but rather his organized crime syndicate and its many shady business ventures, including bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, and racketeering. All in all, the Chicago outfit brought in around $100 million a year. This outfit did fund his fashion too, and he became known for dressing in flashy suits. Number 34. Capone's name is frequently linked to the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. On the morning of February 14, 1929, 7 men linked to the George Bugs Moran gang were lined up against a wall in a garage in Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood and executed. These victims included a mechanic who worked for Moran, an optometrist connected to the group, and 5 of Moran's criminal business associates. This attack was carried out by a group of at least 4 men, several of whom dressed up as police officers who staged a fake alcohol raid on Moran's headquarters. One witness survived but refused to talk. The perpetrators were never identified, but Capone was heavily suspected to have ordered the hit. However, there was not enough evidence to move forward with the case, and he was never charged for his alleged involvement. Number 33. To many impoverished Chicagoans, Capone was an unlikely hero. In 1929, the stock market crashed, and the United States was plunged into the Great Depression. Not long after, in November 1930, the Chicago Tribune reported on a soup kitchen that had opened on South State Street, feeding the hungry out of its storefront. It served breakfast, lunch, and dinner to an average of 2,200 Chicago citizens per day, and its owner was none other than Al Capone. There were coffee and donuts for breakfast, soup and bread for lunch, and soup, coffee, and bread for dinner. On Thanksgiving that same year, the Capone-run soup kitchen served holiday meals to 5,000 people. Turkey was originally on the menu until a heist of 1,000 turkeys had been reported. Supposedly, Capone was worried he would be blamed for the robbery if he served turkey, so the menu switched to beef stew at the last minute. People were more than happy to accept his charity in spite of his criminal reputation. The Bismarck Tribune put it this way: "A hungry man is just as glad to get soup and coffee from Al Capone as from anyone else." Number 32. Al Capone was actually never convicted for any of his most famous crimes. He managed to keep himself out of prison by paying off cops and public officials with his impressive wealth. But as they say, mo money, mo problems. And it was Capone's handling of his funds that would lead to his only major conviction. In 1927, the Supreme Court ruled that money made from trafficking in liquor was subject to income tax. Federal prosecutors used this to build a case against Capone for tax evasion and income tax fraud. And in June of 1931, he was indicted. In October 1931, he was found guilty and sentenced to 11 years in prison. Number 31. According to the memoirs of Secret Service agent Mike Riley, after Capone's tax evasion conviction, the United States Treasury Department seized several of Capone's assets, including one of his bulletproof cars. It was kept in storage until December 1941, when the Secret Service became concerned that a German or Japanese agent might attempt to assassinate President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They decided that the president should be driven around in an armored car as soon as possible, but it was difficult to find one so quickly. So Riley, the agent in charge of the service's White House detail, decided to borrow Al Capone's car instead. A team of government-employed mechanics worked on the car through the night and had it ready for the president the next day. FDR used the car until 1942. This fact has been repeated ad nauseum everywhere, from books to the History Channel documentaries to interesting fact videos like this one. But it's actually a myth. Where did the myth originate from? Most sources speculate that it was a mix of Mike Riley trying to make his memoirs more interesting, crossing over with an auctioneer's desire to boost the value of Al Capone's car by also trying to mix FDR into it. It's an act of price-inflating trickery that old Al himself would have probably been proud of. Number 30. Imagine being at the funeral of a loved one whacked by the mob when a beautiful flower arrangement arrives. What's the name on that card? Oh, it's just the guy who killed him. One of Capone's most famous signature moves was the tendency for him to send expensive flower arrangements to the funerals of the men he had killed. In one case, at the 1926 funeral of Dean O'Banion, he reportedly gifted a $1,000 floral funeral wreath. In another instance, he supposedly sent as much as $5,000. Number 29. Al Capone wasn't always on the grind. He also focused on his family. In 1918, he married an Irish girl named May Coughlin. The two had one son together, Sonny, and remained married until Al's death, in spite of his serial infidelity. Number 28. The infamous baseball bat scene from the movie The Untouchables is supposedly based on a real incident, and it was gnarly. A Sicilian mobster by the name of Joe Aiello convinced a few of Capone's gangsters to help him overthrow him. But one of Capone's bodyguards discovered the conspiracy and informed him. He invited the men to dinner, and after everyone had finished eating, he told them he knew what they had planned. He had his bodyguards tie the men to their chairs, and he picked up a baseball bat. Author John Cobbler wrote about what happened next, describing it like this. Slowly, he walked the length of the table and halted behind the first guest of honor. With both hands, he lifted the bat and slammed it down full force. Slowly, methodically, he struck again and again, breaking bones in the man's shoulders, arms, and chest. He moved to the next man, and when he had reduced him to mangled flesh and bone, to the third. One of the bodyguards then fetched his revolver from the check room and shot each man in the back of the head. Brian De Palma used this anecdote as inspiration for The Untouchables. Number 27. Capone had many friends in high places during his criminal career, and one of the most notable was Chicago Mayor William Hale Bill Thompson. In 1927, Thompson announced plans to go light on prohibition enforcement, and Capone took notice. He gave over $100,000 to Thompson's campaign fund and publicly endorsed him as a mayoral candidate. This cozy relationship with Capone earned Thompson a reputation among some historians as the worst mayor in American history. Number 26. Capone was one of the first celebrity prisoners at Alcatraz. After he was sentenced to prison for tax evasion, Capone was first placed in the U.S. penitentiary in Atlanta. 2 years later, however, in August 1934, he and a group of inmates were sent to California by train. Then they were transported to the soon-to-be infamous penitentiary on Alcatraz Island in the San Francisco Bay. The newly opened prison was designed to be maximum security and intended for criminals who were especially violent or unruly. Capone had no notable behavioral issues in Atlanta, so was likely sent to Alcatraz to raise its public profile and get people talking about the new prison. Given how famous Alcatraz is today and how closely it is associated with Capone, it seems that strategy worked. Number 25. You'd think that Capone's reputation would make everyone in prison too afraid to mess with him. Well, you'd be wrong. On June 23, 1936, Capone's fellow inmate James Tex Lucas, who was serving time for bank robbery, murder, and auto theft, attacked him in the shower. Using half a pair of scissors, he slashed Capone across the chest and hands. Lucas claimed that this attack was in retaliation for Capone trying to kill him. Capone was injured but survived the assault with relatively minor wounds. Number 24. It's no secret that as a mobster, Al Capone was a real moneymaker. But did you know he's still raking in the dough decades after his death? Just not for himself, obviously. During a relatively recent auction from the luxury auction house Witherell's, entitled A Century of Notoriety, the Estate of Al Capone listed several of the gangster's personal items at astonishing prices. His platinum Hanes Stiletti pocket knife containing 20 single-cut diamonds went for $2,500 to $5,000. His Patek Philippe pocket watch with 90 single-cut diamonds went for $25,000 to $50,000. And his Colt Model 1911 semi-automatic pistol went up for $100,000 to $150,000. Number 23. Because of federal agent Elliot Ness's memoirs, The Untouchables, many consider him to be the man who took down Al Capone once and for all. However, his role in Capone's downfall has been greatly exaggerated. He was a prohibition agent, and along with his team, he raided breweries linked to Capone's bootlegging businesses. His team supposedly refused to accept bribes, earning them the nicknames the Untouchables in the press. That much is true. His work helped lead to Capone's indictment for violations of prohibition, but the tax evasion charges are what sent Capone to prison. Add in the fact that many details of Ness's memoir were exaggerated by his co-author Oscar Fraley, and it becomes clear that Ness didn't bring Capone down so much as he was one piece of a much larger puzzle. Number 22. Capone didn't expect to serve more than a year or two in prison when he was put on trial for his tax evasion. He pleaded guilty to 2 of the indictments and admitted guilt to a list of 5,000 charges related to a conspiracy to violate prohibition laws. But he didn't get the deal he hoped for, and the judge refused to accept the plea deal. So, much to his shock, Capone was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. Number 21. Prison wasn't always so bad for Capone, at least as far as prison goes. While in prisons in Philadelphia and Atlanta, he would pay guards in cash for access to special items for his cell, such as a reading chair, fine rugs, art, and a radio. While at Eastern State Penitentiary, he often enjoyed listening to waltzes in his cell. Number 20. In 1928, Capone purchased a property in sunny Miami Beach, Florida. But it wasn't always relaxation and fun in the sun for him there. The locals bristled at his arrival, afraid his presence would bring gambling and corruption to the city. Even though the crime was already prevalent in South Florida, Capone was blamed for it getting worse. Florida officials leaped into action as the city sued him, calling his home there a menace to the safety and well-being of residents. The governor of Florida ordered all sheriffs to arrest him on sight. Number 19. Whenever he was confronted about his criminal lifestyle and the ways he made his money, Capone never showed a bit of remorse. He called his work a public service to the people of Chicago, saying 90% of the people of Cook County drink and gamble, and my offense has been to furnish them with those amusements. In his eyes, it may have been illegal, but hey, pretty much everyone was doing it. Number 18. Al Capone finally met his match in the form of a sexually transmitted bacterial infection. During Al Capone's first job in Chicago as a bouncer at a bordello, he sampled the business's offerings and found himself with a case of the syphilis. Embarrassed at contracting a venereal disease, he didn't see a doctor about the infection, and so the infection developed, unseen and unchecked, for years. It might not have seemed like much was wrong. Syphilis manifests as a sore, and then it can clear up, followed by a rash all over the body, which clears up in time as well. After that, it can lie dormant for years at a time. But while it wasn't troubling Capone with the symptoms, the infection was wreaking havoc on his heart, liver, and brain. By the time his symptoms began to show again, it was already too late. Signs of neurosyphilis, or the progression and infection of the brain, began to manifest during Capone's time at Alcatraz. He struggled to process instructions from the guards, unable to follow them even at the risk of punishment. He had a near-constant strange grin on his face and was seen dressed in a winter coat, hat, and gloves while sitting in his heated cell. In February of 1938, he received a formal diagnosis of neurosyphilis. Number 17. To fight the syphilis, doctors gave Capone injections to induce malaria, hoping that the subsequent fevers would raise his body temperature enough to wipe out the syphilis infection. As you might have guessed, this treatment was not successful, and being deliberately given malaria nearly cost Capone his life. He survived and was transferred from Alcatraz to the Federal Correctional Institution at Terminal Island. During the final days of his life, Al Capone lived in isolation at his family's Florida home. As the symptoms of the disease progressed, his mental state became more and more fractured. According to his family, he would experience complete breaks from reality, having entire conversations with hallucinations of mobsters he had killed over the years. He suffered from violent outbursts as well, at one point physically attacking his brother John unprovoked. This led to the family's decision to care for him themselves rather than bringing in any outside help or, quote, strangers in. Number 15. Before he fell into a life of crime, Capone spent his childhood studying at a strict Catholic elementary school. He was an intelligent kid, but strong-willed and often unwilling to comply with the code of conduct there. One particular incident was the straw that broke the camel's back. After deciding that Capone was being rude during the class, one of his teachers took matters into her own hands, literally. She used corporal punishment, beating him for his misconduct. Young Capone struck back, hitting her in the face. He was sent to the principal's office and beaten all over again. After that day, Capone left school and never went back. Number 14. Young Al Capone had hobbies aside from petty crime and barroom scuffles. As it turns out, he was something of an athlete. According to historian Mario Gomez, Capone played baseball alongside his brother Ralph from 1916 to 1918. As a first baseman and a pitcher, the two played for St. Michael's in 1916 and then formed the Al Capone Stars in 1918. In the beginning, the team lost most of their games, but when Al began pitching, the team began to win some games. The Brooklyn Citizen wrote up one of their games, saying the feature of the game was the twirling of Al Capone, who whiffed 15 of the opposing batsmen. Al got 3 hits, including a double. Historians missed this chapter of Capone's life for some time due to a simple spelling error, as many of the papers wrote his name as Capone. Capone quit baseball at the end of 1918 when his then-girlfriend and soon-to-be wife got pregnant. Number 13. Though he spent most of his life as a highly visible figure, one who liked it that way and was happy to dress up and talk to the press, he spent the twilight years of his life outside the spotlight. As his health grew worse, he stayed inside and away from the prying eyes of the public and the press alike, spending most of his time fishing and playing cards at his Palm Island, Florida mansion when he wasn't in the hospital. Meanwhile, his wife kept information about his condition away from the press, saying when asked, yes, he's going to get well, he's suffering from dejection and a broken spirit, aggravated by intense nervousness. Number 12. On April 23, 1930, the Chicago Crime Commission, under the leadership of attorney Frank J. Lesh, released its very first list of public enemies. The list was intended to keep the light of publicity shining on Chicago's most prominent, well-known, and notorious gangsters to the end that they may be under constant observation by the law-enforcing authorities and law-abiding citizens. There were 28 men on the list, but the title of public enemy number 1 went to Al Capone. Number 11. In 2000, the Saskatchewan city of Moose Jaw came up with a marketing plan to attract tourists with an interest in mob history and crime. They claimed that Al Capone used the Moose Jaw tunnels to run his bootlegging business during the Prohibition. An exciting story, but there was just one problem: it was not true. According to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, there is no evidence that Capone's bootlegging business ever entered Moose Jaw or even crossed the Canadian border in the first place. Number 10. May, Al Capone's wife, had no other children after their firstborn son, Sonny. She suffered a tragic series of stillbirths and miscarriages, which many historians have attributed to the likelihood that she contracted syphilis from her husband. Number 9. Before the Prohibition, organized crime as we know it today did not really exist in the United States. There were gangs, but they were more like street toughs that Al ran with when he first dropped out of school, doing small-time theft, extortion, and loan sharking. But when the 18th Amendment passed in 1919 and alcohol became illegal, mobsters rushed to fill the gaps in the market. They hired lawyers and accountants, turning their criminal enterprises into business ventures. This put the organized in the organized crime and set the scene for the kind of landscape that Capone took over. Number 8. Although Al Capone famously hated being called Scarface, there was a nickname he enjoyed. He preferred those close to him call him Snorky, which was slang for sharply dressed or well-dressed at the time. It's definitely a more flattering nickname than Scarface. Number 7. Al Capone was once shot by himself. On September 15, 1928, he was getting into a car after a game of golf with Johnny Patton when his .45 went off in his right pants pocket. He was taken to St. Margaret's Hospital in Hammond, where he was treated for a bullet wound to the legs and groin. He was checked in under an assumed name, brought his entourage with him, and had Louis Little New York Campagna stand guard. Number 6. During his time in Alcatraz, Capone was not just suffering from neurodegenerative effects of syphilis, he was also going through extreme cocaine withdrawal. His abuse of the substance had been so severe that it caused a perforation in his nasal septum. At the time, the symptom was attributed to syphilis, but a later examination of his x-rays showed little sign that the disease had progressed into his sinuses. It was much more to have been from the cocaine use. Number 5. When Al Capone was hospitalized for paresis, a condition associated with late-stage syphilis, he was admitted to Union Memorial Hospital in Baltimore. The facility allowed him to bring his entourage with him, which included a fleet of bodyguards, a personal barber, and food tasters who would check his food for poison before allowing him to eat it. Capone felt so well taken care of by Union that in 1939 he purchased 2 Japanese weeping cherry trees for the hospital grounds. In March 1940, in spite of the excellent care he received at Union, he left Baltimore for Florida. Number 4. In the 1940s, as syphilis continued to ravage his body and mind, Capone became one of the first civilians to receive a dose of a new experimental treatment called penicillin. Unfortunately, he received this treatment too late in the progression of the disease, and the infection was not cured. Number 3. By the end of his life, Al Capone was all but flat broke. His income was limited to $600 a week to support him and his entire family, provided to him by former associates from his Chicago outfit. 5 years after his death, May was forced to sell their home due to financial troubles. The combination of government fines, medical bills, and misfortune had taken the Capones from a life of luxury to almost nothing at all. Number 2. On January 21, 1947, Al Capone suffered a stroke. May called Dr. Phillips at 5 a.m. that day, and the physician noted that his limbs were convulsing, his face drawn, pupils dilated, and eyes and jaws were set. He was given medication to stop his seizures, and the paralysis in his limbs and face soon abated. But he had also come down with a case of bronchial pneumonia. He was given oxygen and medications to slow the progression of heart failure, but he began to drift in and out of consciousness. On January 25 at 7:25 p.m., Al Capone died of cardiac arrest caused by pneumonia. Number 1. Right up until his death, the press had staked out Al Capone's home in Florida, hoping for a glimpse of the elusive former mobster. So, when he died, his loved ones were eager to avoid his body becoming a spectacle. He was secretly transported in a regular car along Highway 41 from the Florida estate to Chicago. That evening, Capone's son, Sonny, made a public announcement to the press. His father was dead. A hearse arrived at the Florida home, leaving with an empty casket in tow. A funeral was held the following day. It was attended by family members still in Miami, as well as a variety of big Florida names, including the actor and musician Desi Arnaz. 2 days later, the family traveled to Chicago by train, accompanied by the empty coffin. When the press assumed Capone's body was on the train, it was already in Chicago, waiting for the family at Rago Funeral Home. Meanwhile, members of the Chicago outfit spread the word to his loyal members, informing them of the time and location of the real funeral. After a mass at Holy Name Cathedral in Chicago, Capone was laid to rest at Mount Olivet Cemetery on February 1st. It was 3 days before the scheduled date given to the press. Today, Capone is buried in Mount Carmel Cemetery. Now, check out how Al Capone was brought down by a mysterious mic, or watch this video instead.